She was just a maid, cleaning a billionaire's mansion, trying to stay invisible. But one late night, in a bright, steamy washroom with glossy black tiles, everything changed. When Bennett Nolan stepped in, he saw something Julia Rose never wanted anyone to see, and it froze him in place. What he discovered wasn't just a scar. It was a story of survival, strength, and a kind of love that no amount of money could ever buy. The Nolan estate stood like a silent palace on the hill, its white stone walls catching the morning sun like polished glass. Inside, the air smelled faintly of roses and expensive wood polish. Every room carried its own quiet story, every corridor lined with paintings whose frames gleamed like gold. Julia Rose, just 22, had been working here for only 3 weeks, yet she already moved through the halls as if they were a maze she dared not disturb. Every morning, her soft footsteps whispered across marble floors that shone like mirrors. She polished them until she could see her own reflection, not because she liked to see herself, but because the job demanded perfection. Her hands were quick, gentle, and careful. She dusted each painting frame with delicate strokes, her fingers brushing the gold leaf edges like she feared they might crumble. Some of those paintings looked older than her, worth more than everything she had ever owned combined. She kept her head down, always, not because she was shy, but because it was safer that way. Safer not to be noticed. Safer not to attract questions she didn't want to answer. There was a secret, one she guarded the way a soldier guards the last line of defense. A reason she'd taken this job instead of any other. A reason she kept to herself, even when the other staff tried to be friendly. The mansion was beautiful, yes. But beauty could be a trap, and Julia knew that better than most. Bennett Nolan, the man who owned this mansion, was not someone you could simply greet in the hallway. He was 35 years old, and his presence carried a weight that seemed to slow the air around him. His sharp mind and cold demeanor made him untouchable to most. Those piercing blue eyes of his, eyes that saw too much and trusted too little, had a way of making people drop their gaze. The staff whispered about him when they thought no one could hear. Some said his wealth had turned his heart to stone. Others said he had been hurt once and never recovered. No one really knew. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one broke through Bennett Nolan's walls. And yet, in the quiet hours when Bennett crossed the marble halls, he noticed her. The new maid. The one who never looked directly at him. The one whose politeness felt intentional. She didn't stumble over words the way others did around him. She didn't try to make conversation. Instead, she kept her distance as if his shadow was dangerous. He should have liked that. After all, he valued privacy more than most things. But for some reason, it didn't feel like respect. It felt like avoidance. Avoidance that came from fear. One evening, as he stood at the top of the grand staircase, he saw her far below, adjusting a vase of fresh lilies. Her movements were slow, almost graceful, but her eyes flickered toward the door as though always calculating an escape. Something about that unsettled him. A question formed in his mind, one he couldn't shake. What is she hiding? He told himself it wasn't his business. She was staff, nothing more. But deep down, he already knew he wouldn't be able to ignore it for long. The mansion was full of locked rooms, hidden corridors, and silent rules. But in Bennett's eyes, Julia Rose had just become its greatest mystery. The house was wrapped in silence. It was the kind of silence that made footsteps echo twice as loud and the ticking of a clock sound like a heartbeat. Most of the staff had already gone home. The grand halls, usually filled with quiet movement and soft voices, now stood empty, bathed in the golden glow of low lights. Julia remained, finishing her final task for the night. She was in the guest washroom, one of the most beautiful rooms in the mansion. The walls were polished cream marble, streaked with veins of gold that shimmered under the light. A chandelier hung above, scattering tiny flecks of crystal light across the room. Kneeling near the floor-to-ceiling mirror, Julia worked with a small cloth, polishing the edges until they gleamed. She hummed under her breath, a soft, fragile tune that seemed to belong to another time in her life. Her eyes were focused on her task, her mind elsewhere. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. She didn't notice the faint shadow that crept across the marble floor. The door opened so quietly it was as though the air itself moved it. Bennett Nolan had been walking past. He wasn't supposed to be here, not at this hour. He preferred his private wing of the house at night, away from the noise of work. But tonight, he had decided to take a walk through the East Wing. And that's when he heard it. A voice. Not speaking, not calling, and just humming. Soft, almost trembling. He stopped. His curiosity drew him closer. When he stepped inside, his presence filled the space without a word. Julia startled, her head jerking up. Her heart seemed to skip. She stood quickly, her movements sharp, almost defensive. "Sir, I'm almost done," she blurted out, gripping the cleaning cloth in her hand. She tried to move past him, but the narrow space between the sink and counter forced her to brush too close. In her hurry, the hem of her dress caught on the corner of the marble counter. The fabric tugged upward. Not much, but enough for her eyes to widen. "Wait!" Bennett's voice was low, commanding as he stepped forward. Her hands shot down, pressing the fabric firmly against her legs. Her breath came faster. "Please, don't lift my dress," she whispered, her voice shaking in a way that did not match the simple act. It wasn't embarrassment. It was fear. Real fear. Bennett froze. That fear slid under his skin, making his chest tighten. Her tone wasn't playful. It wasn't shy. It was desperate. For a moment, he considered stepping back, letting her go. But something deep, unshakable, kept him still. He could feel the question rising inside him, heavy and unstoppable. Slowly, he reached down, his fingers brushing hers as he moved her hands away. She tensed instantly, her body stiff as stone. When the fabric lifted slightly, the air in the room seemed to change. Bennett's eyes caught on something that made the rest of the world fade away. His expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something else. Something softer, heavier. Julia's gaze darted to the floor, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. In that moment, Bennett realized this wasn't a maid's simple modesty. This was a scar she was hiding, not just on her skin, but in her soul. And suddenly he couldn't decide which cut deeper. The fabric rose only a few inches, but it was enough. Enough to make Bennett's eyes lock on what lay beneath. There, across Julia's pale skin, ran a scar, long, deep, and jagged, stretching from her upper thigh to her hip. It wasn't the kind of mark life gives by accident. This was deliberate. This was violence, written in flesh. It had healed, but the memory it carried had not. The edges were faded, yet the story behind it burned fresh in the air between them. Bennett felt his chest tighten, not just from shock, but from something sharper. Anger, not at her. At the fact that someone had once done this. Julia. His voice came softer than he expected, breaking through the silence. "Who did this to you?" The words seemed to hang in the air like fragile glass. He saw her shoulders stiffen, her back still turned toward him. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Just enough for him to see her profile, the way her lips trembled. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "I'm here to work, not talk about my past." But Bennett could hear what her voice tried to hide. The fear, the exhaustion, the weight of carrying something alone for too long. He saw the way she kept her chin slightly up, refusing to let the moment crush her. And in that tiny, defiant gesture, he recognized something else. Strength. The kind of strength that isn't loud but survives anyway. His gaze lingered, not on the scar, but on her. On the way her hands gripped the edge of the counter as if steadying herself. On the way her breath came slow, deliberate, like she was forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm not asking as your employer," Bennett said finally, his voice lower now. "I'm asking as a man who doesn't like seeing someone carry pain they shouldn't have to." Julia's eyes flickered toward his. There was something unreadable in them, a mixture of caution, gratitude, and something softer she quickly buried again. She gave a faint shake of her head. "Some things are better left alone." Bennett didn't touch her again, but his eyes didn't leave her. "Maybe to you," he murmured, "but it matters to me." The tension between them was heavy, not dangerous, but intimate in a way neither had expected. He saw the guarded walls she'd built around herself. She saw the sincerity in his voice, a sincerity she didn't expect from a man like him. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Julia stepped back, smoothing her dress down, her posture stiff. Without another word, she left the washroom, her footsteps fading into the hallway. Bennett stood there for a long time after, staring at the marble floor. But his mind wasn't on the floor. It was on that scar, and on the truth he was now determined to uncover, not for curiosity, but because, for reasons he couldn't explain yet, he wanted to protect her. The mansion was quiet again that night, but not in the same way as before. This time, the silence between Bennett and Julia had a pulse to it, as if the air carried the memory of what had happened in the washroom. Bennett found her later in the staff hallway, standing at the long wooden table where freshly laundered sheets lay in neat stacks. Her slender hands moved over the fabric, folding with precise, practiced motions. She didn't notice him at first, or maybe she did, and simply chose not to acknowledge him. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said, his tone softer than usual. Julia's hands froze mid-fold. Her back remained to him for a moment. Then she exhaled a slow breath. Turning slightly, she met his gaze. "Maybe not," she murmured, "but I have every reason to be careful." Bennett didn't push her. Instead, he stepped into the room, closing the space between them by only a few feet. Her eyes followed him warily, not in fear of what he'd do, but as though she was weighing whether or not she could trust him. Finally, she set the folded sheet aside and leaned back against the table. Her fingers twisted together, a small nervous habit. "When I was a teenager," she began slowly, "I worked for a family that treated me like nothing. I was just a thing in the background, invisible until they wanted something." Bennett's brow furrowed, but he stayed silent, letting her speak. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "The man of the house, he tried to hurt me." The words trembled but didn't break. "I fought back. I escaped. But I was left with this scar." Bennett's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. Images flashed in his mind, a younger Julia, terrified and alone, defending herself against someone who should have been protecting her. "And no one protected you?" His voice was quiet but carried a dangerous edge. "No one," she said, her tone flat, as though the memory had been pressed into her bones. Her gaze lifted, meeting his directly for the first time since she started speaking. "They saw me as poor, unworthy, just because I wasn't from their world, just because my family didn't have money." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired acceptance. But that acceptance pierced Bennett deeper than anger ever could. For a long moment, the two of them stood in the soft hum of the hallway. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed, marking the slow passing of time. Bennett studied her face, the steady eyes, the proud posture, the quiet courage it took to speak these words aloud. He realized something then. Her strength wasn't in the absence of fear. It was in the choice to live, to keep moving forward, despite it. And for the first time in years, something cracked in his own chest. Not pity, not the cold calculation he so often relied on, but respect. "I can't change what happened to you," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I can tell you this. No one will ever touch you like that again. Not while I'm here." Julia's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to reply but didn't know how. She searched his face, looking for a lie, for some sign that his words were just a polite gesture. She found none. Instead, she found sincerity, the kind that didn't demand trust, but offered it freely. For a second, the air between them shifted, softer now, almost warm. But Julia broke it first, stepping back toward the laundry, her hands busying themselves again. Bennett didn't stop her. But as he left the hallway, his mind was already made up. He wasn't going to let her keep carrying this alone. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of the Nolan dining room, spilling over the polished oak table. Usually, this room felt too large, too formal, as if it existed only for grand dinners and quiet, solitary breakfasts. But today, something was different. Julia stepped in, holding a tray of fresh linen napkins, expecting to set the table for Bennett's usual solitary morning. Instead, she found him already seated at the far end, not with his standard black coffee, but with 2 cups placed in front of him. Her steps slowed. This was not routine. This was not the distant, untouchable Bennett Nolan she had learned to work around. "Sit," he said simply, his voice carrying across the room. She blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "Sir, Julia," he interrupted gently but firmly. "I don't see you as a maid. I see you as a woman who survived something no one should have to face. You deserve to be treated like more than just a servant." The words caught her off guard. They weren't polished compliments meant to charm. They weren't commands wrapped in authority. They were human. She hesitated, standing there with the tray pressed lightly to her waist, her fingers tightening against its edge. No one in years had spoken to her like that, without pity, without judgment, without hidden motives. Bennett waited, his gaze steady as if telling her he would not withdraw the offer simply because she was slow to take it. Finally, with cautious steps, Julia set the tray aside and moved toward the table. The chair creaked softly as she lowered herself into it, still unsure why she was there. For a moment, they sat in silence. The faint clink of a spoon against porcelain broke the quiet as Bennett stirred his coffee. He slid the other cup toward her. "Tea," he said. "You strike me as a tea person." Julia stared at the cup for a second before wrapping her hands around its warmth. Her voice was quiet. "Thank you." Bennett studied her, not in the way men sometimes looked at women, but as though every word she spoke mattered. "You know," he said slowly, "most people think strength is about power or control. But the kind you have, it's rarer. It's the kind that survives quietly, even when no one notices." Her throat tightened at the unexpected softness in his tone. She had heard praise before, but never like this. This was not admiration for beauty or skill. This was recognition of something deeper. Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and in that moment, the walls between them seemed to thin. Bennett's hand moved across the polished surface of the table, stopping just before hers. He didn't grab her hand. He didn't trap it beneath his. Instead, his fingers brushed lightly against hers, a subtle, deliberate contact that sent a strange, warm ripple through her. It wasn't the touch of a billionaire claiming something as his. It wasn't a possession. It was a promise, a silent vow that she could trust him. Julia didn't pull away. Her fingers, still resting on the table, shifted slightly, almost instinctively, closer to his. It was a small movement, but it spoke louder than words, and for the first time in years she felt safe. Weeks passed, but for Julia, time inside the Nolan mansion began to feel different. The cold corridors didn't seem so intimidating anymore. The echo of her footsteps was no longer the only sound she heard. Now there was the occasional low chuckle from Bennett when she passed him in the hallway, or the sound of his voice calling her name, asking for her help with things she suspected he didn't really need help with. Bennett had a way of appearing at the most unexpected times. If she carried a heavy tray, he was there, taking half the weight without being asked. If she worked in the garden, he'd stroll beside her, pretending to examine the roses, but really asking questions about her childhood, her dreams, her favorite books. Some nights, she found herself in the library with him, sitting across from the crackling fireplace, talking until the hour grew late and the tea in their cups went cold. Julia tried to tell herself it was nothing. He was just being kind. A man like him couldn't see someone like her as anything more than part of the staff. And yet each day, those moments together carved deeper into her heart. One evening, as she made her way toward the servants' wing, Bennett appeared at the top of the grand staircase. The chandelier above glimmered, casting soft light over him, his hand resting on the polished banister. "Julia," he called gently. She turned, startled to find him waiting there. The look in his eyes wasn't the cool, distant gaze she had first known. It was warm, steady, almost vulnerable. "I know where I stand in life," he began, descending the stairs slowly. "But I don't care about wealth or titles." His footsteps were quiet against the marble, but his voice filled the space. "I care about the woman who taught me that strength isn't in money. It's in surviving, in forgiving, and in loving despite the pain." Julia's breath caught. Her throat felt tight, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Bennett, I never thought a man from your world would want someone like me." He reached the last step, closing the space between them with unhurried steps. "Someone like you?" His voice softened into something almost reverent. "Julia, there's no one like you." Her eyes glistened as his hands came up, cupping her face with the gentlest touch, as if she were something precious and unbreakable all at once. And then his lips met hers. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't claiming. It was slow, certain. A kiss that wasn't about possession, but about promise. In that moment, Julia felt the years of fear and guardedness begin to loosen their hold on her. This wasn't the kind of love that looked for perfection or polished backgrounds. It was the kind that saw scars and didn't flinch, the kind that saw her whole. From that day forward, the Nolan mansion no longer felt like a place of marble floors and gold-framed portraits. It became something warmer. The staff noticed small changes. Bennett walking alongside Julia as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his hand brushing hers when no one was looking. The laughter they shared while arranging flowers in the drawing room. The quiet moments in the garden when the world seemed to disappear. The lesson their love carried spread quietly among those who served in the house. That status was meaningless in the face of real connection. That no amount of money could buy the courage it took to love someone for who they truly were, scars and all. In a world too often divided by wealth, appearance, or background, their story was a reminder that the heart does not keep ledgers. It simply chooses. And Bennett Nolan, the man who once kept everyone at a distance, had chosen Julia Rose. Not because she was perfect, not because she came from his world, but because she had survived it, and because her heart, against all odds, still knew how to love.